First story, The Shadows of Evermore. It was a chilly autumn night when I found myself driving through the desolate roads of Maine. The town of Evermore was not on any map I had seen, but its name had come up in a conversation with a local bartender earlier that evening. Stay away from Evermore had warned me, his voice a low whisper as if uttering its name invoked a curse. No one comes back the same from that place. His words played on a loop in my mind as I pulled up to a rusted iron gate marked with the words, Evermore Cemetery. The gate creaked open on its own, a chilling invitation to the forbidden grounds. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the headstones that seemed to lean towards me like accusing fingers. I was a writer looking for a story, and this place reeked of untold tales and dark secrets. As I walked deeper into the cemetery, the air grew colder. A low hum filled my ears. It sounded like whispers at first, but soon it became clear that it was a chant in a language I did not understand. Who dares disturb the rest of the damned? A voice boomed from the shadows. I froze, unable to pinpoint the source of the voice. My heart pounded in my chest as the chanting grew louder and the shadows around me seemed to move closer. Suddenly, a figure emerged from behind a crypt. It was a man dressed in a tattered black suit, his face pale and his eyes hollow, as if they held no soul. He pointed a bony finger at me, and the ground beneath me began to shake. Leave now, or be claimed by the shadows, he hissed. But before I could respond, the ground opened up beneath me. I fell into darkness. I landed hard on a cold, damp surface. The smell of rotting flesh and mildew hit me immediately, and I realized I was in some kind of underground chamber. The walls were lined with decaying bones. The air was thick with a malevolent energy. A faint light came from a torch in the distance, and as I moved towards it, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning slowly, I saw them again. The figures in black robes. This time, their faces were hidden beneath hoods, and they carried candles that flickered despite the still air. They surrounded me in a perfect circle, their chanting growing louder and more intense. The ground beneath me shook, and a glowing symbol appeared at my feet. It looked ancient and forbidden, like something out a book on dark rituals. The man in the tattered suit appeared once again, this time holding a large book bound in what looked like human skin. He began to read from it, his voice deep and otherworldly. The sacrifice is complete. The soul is ours. The shadows will rise. I screamed, but no sound came out. My body felt like it was on fire, and I could feel something being ripped from me. It was as if my very essence was being pulled into the symbol beneath me. The last thing I remember was the faces of the hooded figures, their expressions twisted into something inhuman. Then everything went black. I woke up in a hospital room 3 days later. The doctors told me I had been found unconscious on the side of the road outside Evermore. But I knew the truth. Something had been taken from me that night, and I was no longer the person I used to be. Every night since then, have heard the whispers of the shadows. They call to me, beckoning me to return to Evermore. And I know that one day I won't be able to resist. Second story, the graveyard of Ashland Hollow. It was a cold autumn evening. Second, I arrived in Windham, a small town in New Hampshire. I had heard about it before, but never had I thought I would end up here. The town was known for its quiet streets and long-forgotten history. But there was one thing that everyone in the town tried to avoid. A place called Ashland Hollow. It was a graveyard, but not just any graveyard. The graveyard. The locals whispered about it in hushed tones and deep grinning on. Warning, strangers, stay away. They spoke of the unseen forces that lurked there, waiting for the next victim. But I was curious, and when I saw the old gate creak open on its own, I couldn't resist the temptation to step inside. Verily, step inside. The gate was rusted, its iron bars covered in ivy. I pushed it open, and felt air grow colder. The stone path before me was overgrown with weeds, and the moon cast a pale light on the old tombstones. The graveyard was dead, silent. There were no birds chirping, wind rustling through the trees. It was as if the very earth was holding its breath. The tombstones were worn and tilted, their inscriptions barely legible. He felt a strange tension in the air. It was as if I wasn't alone. I looked around, but there was no one. The graveyard seemed to stretch on forever. The whispering started softly, so faint that I thought it was just the wind. But then it grew louder, closer. It sounded like 1,000 voices, all calling my name. Ethan, they whispered. I stopped dead in my tracks. Was sure I had heard someone speak, but there was no one. The ground beneath my feet felt uneven. I felt my heart begin to race, pounding in my chest. I turned to leave, but the gate I had entered through was now gone. There was only the silent graveyard. I was trapped. A cold wind blew through the graveyard, sending chills down my spine. I turned around and saw a figure emerging from the ground. At first, I thought it was a trick of the moonlight, but as it grew closer, I realized it was a man. His skin was pale, transparent. His eyes were sunken and dead. His mouth was twisted in a mocking grin. He reached out with long, bony fingers, and I felt the air grow colder. "You should not have come here," he said, his voice low and hollow. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy, like I was walking through mud. The ground seemed shift beneath me, and the whispers grew louder, closer. Then I saw something even more terrifying. From the graves around me, figures began to rise. They were all dead. Therein, faces were rot. Life and teeth was mopping at the script. Their bodies decaying. They moved toward me, their eyes empty, but full of hunger. Tried to scream, but no sound came from my mouth. In the distance, I saw another figure. This one was different. He was dressed in a suit, his expression serene. He was holding a small object in his hand. As I walked toward him, I felt compelled to ask, "Who looked at me?" His eyes empty, yet knowing. "I, the keeper of the hollow," he said, his voice calm. I looked at the object in his hand. It was a pendant, old and silver. It was inscribed with symbol I could not recognize. "Take it. It will help you." I reached for it, but as my fingers touched it, the ground shifted beneath me. I heard a loud crack, and suddenly I was falling. I fell into the earth, into the graves. I could see the faces of the dead staring up at me, their eyes wide with hunger. And then everything went dark. Woke up in the graveyard, surrounded by the dead. I felt the cold hands of the undead reach for me. I realized that I was one of them. I was lost forever, a part of Ashland Hollow. Third, story whispering tombstones. I had never believed in ghosts or spirits until I stumbled upon St. Matthew's Cemetery on the outskirts of Grayson Falls, a small town in North Carolina. It was late at night when I decided to take a walk through the cemetery after hearing strange rumors about the place from the locals. I was trying to clear my head after a long day of work. You act straight, but something felt off from the moment I stepped onto the old stone pathways. The air was thick with fog, and the moon barely illuminated the weathered gravestones. As I walked deeper into the cemetery, the quiet grew more unnerving, until I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, but it grew louder as I continued through rows of tombstones. The words were indistinct, but I could feel the chill in the air growing stronger with every step. I paused and looked around, but saw nothing but shadows and stone. Suddenly, cold breeze whistled through the trees, and I heard the whisper again, this time clearer. "Leave now, before it's too late." I felt a shiver run down my spine. But my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to move further into the cemetery, determined to find the source of the voice. The whisper grew louder with each step until it was no longer a whisper, but a growl. The whisper turned into a chant, a low and eerie melody that seemed to come from every direction. I tried to turn back, faster for the side, but my legs felt heavy, as if the ground itself was holding me down. I could see the shadows moving, twisting and shaping themselves into figures that I could barely make out. Then the fog parted for a moment, and I saw it. Gravestone standing alone in the center of the cemetery, larger than the others, with a name etched into the marble. Miriam Hawthorne. I walked toward it, my hands shaking. The whisper was now a deafening roar, drowning out everything else. As I reached the tombstone, felt a cold hand brush against my neck, and I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Suddenly, a low voice spoke directly into my ear. "You should not have come." Turned back toward the tombstone, and the name on it began to change. The letters twisted and contorted until they spelled out something else. Miriam Hawthorne will never let you leave. I felt the ground beneath me crack, and I screamed as I was pulled into the earth. The last thing I remembered was the screaming and the whispering voices as I was buried alive, just like Miriam Hawthorne had been years before. And now I am the one who whispers to those who dare to enter the graveyard after dark. Fourth story, the shadows of Stony Brook. I had heard the whispers before. I even set foot in Stony Brook. But nothing could prepare me for the night I spent on that forgotten graveyard. It was late October, a chilly night. The kind of night where the fog rolls in thick, the moon casts shadows that seem to move. I was just passing through this tiny town in the middle of nowhere, hoping to get some rest before continuing my journey. The locals had been odd, almost too quiet, whispering among themselves whenever I entered the town's only store. But there was nothing remarkable about Stony Brook at first glance. A sleepy town with an old graveyard on the outskirts, which was exactly what I wanted. Peace, quiet, a place to rest. But then I saw the cemetery. It was old, overgrown with weeds, the tombstones tilted and weathered, each one seemingly standing on the edge of collapsing. There was something wrong about it. An unnatural silence hung in the air. The kinds of silence that make you feel like being watched, even if there was no one in sight. As I walked through the wrought iron gates, I could see the shadows of the graveyard's residents moving at the edges of my vision. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, and I felt my steps slowing. I tried to shake the feeling off, but the whispers grew louder. They weren't in my head. They were coming from the graves. "Leave us," the voices whispered. Soft and cold, like the wind had carried their words. I stopped in my tracks. I could feel my heart race, my breathing becoming shallow. The wind whistled through the trees, but the voices were louder, their sound seeping into my bones. Leave. Now. I turned and saw a figure standing at the edge of the cemetery. It was a man, tall, thin, with pale skin. His eyes were dark and empty, like he had never seen the light of day. "You're not welcome here," he said in a low voice. I could feel the chill in his words. They cut through me like a knife. I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. I could feel the ground beneath me shifting. The gravestones were no longer just stones. They were eyes, watching me, studying me. "Leave while you can," the man whispered. I turned and ran, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. But the whispers followed me. The shadows moved faster, growing closer. I could hear footsteps behind me, but I dared not look back. Chest was tight, my legs burning, but I forced myself to keep moving. When I finally reached the gates, I tried to push them open, but they were locked. I was trapped. The man appeared again, only now he was closer. His eyes were growing larger, his hands longer, his face more twisted. "You're never leaving this place," he whispered. I screamed, my voice lost in the wind. The world around me blurred, and then there was nothing. I woke up the next morning, drenched in sweat. The fog had cleared, but the graveyard was still silent. And the man was nowhere to be seen. But as I stood up and looked around, I saw my own name on one of the gravestones. It was etched deep into the stone, as if it had always been there. Realized then, the graveyard had claimed me. And now, I am the Whisperer, the one who will never leave. Every night, I watch the newcomers enter the gates. I feel their fear as they take their first steps onto the hallowed ground, and I whisper to them, "Leave while you can." But they never do. Fifth story, The Cemetery Whispers. I had never believed in ghosts or the supernatural, but all of that changed the night. I found myself walking down the cold, damp path of Cemetery Road in Blackwood, Ohio. It was a night like any other until I saw the old cemetery gate creaking in the wind. Blackwood was a place you could pass through without ever noticing it. A sleepy town with few residents and even fewer visitors. But this particular evening was different. Had come to see an old family grave, one I had only heard about in whispers from my grandmother. The grave had been lost for decades, buried beneath a new layer of earth and time. The moon was full, its light casting long shadows across the rows of gravestones. Felt a chill crawl up my spine as stepped through the gate. At first, It seemed peaceful. The sound of my footsteps was the only noise that broke the silence. But then I heard something else. A low whispering, as if the wind itself was murmuring secrets. Turned quickly, but there was no one in sight. I shook my head, thinking it was just my imagination. But the whispering grew louder. It was coming from direction of the old family plot. I moved towards it, curiosity pushing me forward. As I neared the tombstone, could see a shadow standing beside it. A figure, tall and thin, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the moonlight. Its eyes were wide open, but empty. I called out, but it didn't respond. Instead, it began to move towards me, slowly. Its feet barely touched the ground, as if floating. I tried to run, but my legs felt like they were frozen, rooted to the spot. The whispers grew louder, echoing in my head. Leave this place. Leave now. Its voice a sickening blend of cold and decay. But was too late. The figure reached out, its hands grasping my shoulders. Its touch was icy, sending a wave of pain through my body. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me spun, and I felt my consciousness fading. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying the ground, surrounded by tombstones. The whispers had stopped, but I could feel its presence still lingering just beneath the surface. And as I looked down at my hands, I saw that they were no longer my own. I had become a part of the cemetery. I don't know how long I lay there, my senses numb, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My body felt heavy, my fingers cold and rigid. Yet, I was still aware of everything around me. Lifted my head, my vision, blurry, but steadily sharpening. The moon was still high in the sky, its light shining down on the graveyard. But it was different now. The stones seemed to glow with an otherworldly light, casting an eerie glow across the ground. I tried to move again, but my body remained stiff. My hands gripped the earth beneath me, but instead of dirt and gravel, I felt something smooth and cold. With great effort, I managed to sit up. I looked around, seeing the faces of the dead, their eyes staring out from the gravestones. Each one whispering the same message. You're one of us now. Chill ran through me. I knew in that moment that I was trapped. Not alive, but not fully dead either. I was caught in between worlds, forever part of this place. The whispers grew louder and louder. The voices of the dead called to me, pulling me into the darkness. I was no longer my own. I was the cemetery's. Sixth story, The Whispers of Cedar Hollow. It was a foggy night when I drove into Cedar Hollow. A town buried deep in the heart of Michigan, hidden by dense trees and a feeling of unsettling isolation. The town was silent, except for the distant sound of wind whistling through the branches of old oak trees. I had come here for reasons I could hardly explain. A friend's death that was never fully understood, and creeping feeling that something in this town had a dark hold on me. I'd had heard the rumors before arriving of the cemetery on the outskirts of town, a place said to be cursed, where the dead didn't stay buried. Tread to stare. The locals spoke in whispers, their eyes darting nervously when the subject came up. But my curiosity had been ignited, and I was determined to find out for myself. I was the kind of person who didn't believe in superstitions, in ghost stories, or in the idea that a place could hold onto its dead. But as soon as I drove into Cedar Hollow, I felt something unexplainable. It was as if the town itself was alive, watching, waiting. When I arrived at the cemetery, it was already dark, the moon barely shining through the dense fog. The gates of the cemetery stood tall, rusted and creaking in the wind, a warning that I was not welcome. But I pushed forward, driving past the gates, my nerves tingling. I told myself it was just my imagination. But chill ran down my spine. I parked my car by the side of the road, the wheels making a soft squeal on the gravel. The cemetery was vast, the stones weathered by time, the names erased by centuries of rain and wind. I walked through the rows of forgotten graves. I felt a strange presence, as if someone was watching me. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, almost inaudible, coming from the stone at the center of the cemetery. I stopped listening, and the whisper grew louder, closer. It was calling my name. I felt my stomach drop, a wave of panic rushing through me. But my feet betrayed me, moving forward, compelled by something I could not understand. The wind howled louder, and as I got closer to the stone, saw something that made my blood run cold. Hand, pale and decayed, emerged from the ground, grabbing at my ankles. I stumbled back, but the grip was too strong. The hand pulled me down, the earth beneath me shifting, and I was sucked into the grave. I was buried alive. My heart pounded in my chest, the dirt clinging to my skin, my breath coming in short gasps. I fought to break free, but the earth held me fast, its clutch unrelenting. Then I heard the whispers again, this time clearer, more distinct. They weren't just whispers. They were voices speaking to me. Join us. You are one of us now. The ground shifted beneath me, and I felt a cold hand grip my wrist, pulling me deeper. More hands shot up, grabbing at me, dragging me into the darkness. The dead awakening. I looked around, my eyes wide with terror, and saw more and more figures rising from the dirt, their rotting flesh falling away, their eyes glowing with a hunger I could not understand. The whispers became louder until they were screaming. Could feel my own soul slipping away, my body beginning to deteriorate. The pain was unimaginable, but I could do nothing to stop it. The last thing I heard was my name spoken from the lips of one of the dead. And then everything went black. I was lost, and I would never find my way out. 7th story, The Whispers of Ravenswood. It was a night shrouded in fog when I found myself driving down the lonely road leading to Ravenswood, a town in Massachusetts that no one had ever really heard of. The kind of place that slips off the map like it never existed. The streetlights flickered as I drove further into the heart of the town. Nothing felt right. The wind howled through the trees with secrets I was too afraid to understand. I finally arrived at the Ravenswood Cemetery. It was old, the kind of place that gave you the creeps even before you stepped inside. The gate was rusted, the stone walls were cracked, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. But I was drawn to it, compelled by something I couldn't name. I had heard stories about this place. People spoke in whispers of the things that happened there. Strange noises in the night. Figures seen between the graves. But of those stories ever prepared me for what I was about to find. I walked through the gates and immediately felt it. A presence. Cold chill that ran down my spine. As I moved deeper into the cemetery, I noticed the gravestones were different. Their names were familiar, but the dates of death were wrong. One tombstone read John Miller died 1901, but he was still alive. Another one had a name I recognized from my family's past. Alice Fletcher died 1937, but Alice was alive. Or at least she was the last time I saw her. She was my grandmother. Panic gripped me. What was going on here? How could these people be dead and still be here? I turned around to leave, but suddenly heard a voice, a low whisper. It came from the shadows. Last voice, knew too well. Don't leave me. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was Alice's voice. I looked around, but no one was there. The whisper came again. Please, don't leave. My heart raced. I was frozen in place. I knew I had to go, but I couldn't. Couldn't move. The voice grew louder. I am stuck here, trapped in this place, and so will you be. I turned to run, but the graveyard seemed to stretch on. The gates were no longer there. The road I came in and on had vanished. The whispers were everywhere. You won't escape either. I felt cold hands brush against my skin. I tried to scream, but the words were stuck in my throat. My eyes grew heavy, blurring the world around me. Collapsed to the ground. The fog thickened, and the shadows grew longer. The last thing I heard was the soft echo of Alice's voice, now joined by others. You will never leave Ravenswood. And then silence. I don't know how long I've been here, but I can feel the others around me. Their cold hands are always reaching out. I can never escape. Ravenswood has claimed me, and it will claim you too. 8th story, The Whispers Beneath this Hill. It was what a foggy night when I first heard the stories of Cypress Hill, a seemingly ordinary cemetery on the outskirts of Harperville, a baffling town I had never heard of before. Had never person gone through. Night over was passing through Semser. The locals spoke of it with an unnerving tone. They called it the cursed grounds and warned me to stay far away, but there was something about the place that pulled me in. I could see the outline of the hill in the distance. The silhouettes of weathered gravestones standing against the moonlight. As I walked toward it, the air grew colder, and a strange whispering sound seemed to drift on the breeze. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the whispers were too clear. Too human, too desperate. Help me, help me. Paused and looked around, but there was no one. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, as if someone was watching. But I could not turn back, and something compelled me to move forward. Step by step, the whispers grew louder, and I found myself standing at the gates of Cypress Hill. The cemetery was old, its gates rusted, and the path leading through it was barely visible, hidden by overgrown vines and decaying leaves. It could almost hear the pounding of my heart as I stepped into the graveyard. The fog was thick, clinging to the ground, curling around the gravestones like some living thing. The air was so cold, I could see my breath in front of me. Each exhale a white mist. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The silence was deafening, and then I saw it. A shadow moving between the stones, its shape distorted, its form unearthly. I could feel its presence close, so close, but when I tried to look directly at it, it vanished. I took another step, and then another, until I was standing before a particularly old tombstone, its inscription faded, barely legible. The name etched into the stone was Alden Granger. That name seemed familiar, but I could not remember why. And then I heard it, the whispering again, this time coming from the grave. Come closer. Come closer. Felt my legs moving, could think, and soon I was kneeling at the grave. my fingers tracing the stone. As I touched it, I felt a cold shock run through me, and the ground beneath me shuddered. The grave opened. A hand, pale and decayed, reached up, grasping for me. Screamed, but no sound escaped. I tried to pull away, but the grip was too strong. And then the voice spoke again. You should have listened. Now, you belong to Cypress Hill. The world faded, and I was pulled down into the darkness, into the graves, where the whispers of the dead would never let me go. I was lost, and Cypress Hill had claimed me. Time had no meaning down there. It was eternal. The cold, the darkness, the whispers. I could still hear them, echoing through graves, calling to the living, luring them in. Each night a new soul would arrive, and I would see them stand at the gates, drawn in by the same whispers, the same compulsion, but now knew the truth. The graveyard was not just a place of death. It was a trap, a prison for the lost. And the whispers were its keepers, luring any who dared enter. As I wandered among the graves, the others joined me, their faces twisted with fear, their eyes wide with understanding. But it was too late. We were all trapped forever, and Cypress Hill would never let us go. 9th, the story Silent Graveyard of Glenwood. It was late into the night when I drove down the worn path leading to Glenwood, a small town in Maine. Its name was one I had heard from locals on much actual social road trip, but never paid much attention to the whispers surrounding it. The street lights flickered as I made my way to the edge of town. I had heard about the old graveyard that lay just outside Glenwood, but nobody ever seemed to talk about it directly. Curiosity got the better of me. I decided to pay it a visit. As I drove closer to the graveyard, the air grew thicker, a strange cold settling over the place. I could feel the weight, the history pressing down on me. The gates of the graveyard were old and rusted. I pushed them open, the creak of the hinges sending a chill down my spine. I walked in, feeling the dampness of the ground beneath my feet. I had been told by a local bartender that the graveyard was different, that it was haunted by the ghosts of those who were buried there. I scoffed at the idea of ghosts, thinking it was just town myths. But as I walked through the rows of tombstones shifted, the atmosphere shifted, low whisper began to fill the air. Soft, soft at first, but growing louder as I moved deeper into the graveyard. I stopped and listened, but the words were indistinguishable. The moon was hidden behind clouds, casting the graveyard in an eerie gloom. I could feel the presence of something watching me. Then I saw it. A figure standing in the distance, half hidden behind a large monument. I felt a shiver run through me. I called out, "Hello?" No response. I approached cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. As I got closer, the figure stepped forward, its face pale and twisted. It looked like someone who had been dead for decades. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs felt frozen. The figure stared at me, its eyes empty, yet filled with a terrifying knowledge. It spoke in a voice that sounded like a whisper in a tomb. "You should not have come." Suddenly, the ground beneath me began to tremble. The tombstones around me shifted, and a low growl filled the air. The figure was no longer just a figure. It was a creature, its body a twisted abomination of rotting flesh and bone. Tried to move, but my body was rooted to the spot. The creature moved closer, its breath cold and rotting. I could see its teeth, yellow and sharp as it reached for me. I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of my last breath leaving me. Then, there was silence. When opened my eyes again, I was back in my car. But something was different. The world outside had shifted. The town of Glenwood was no more. The graveyard was still there, but the town had disappeared. I was trapped in a place where time no longer mattered. I was not alone. The whispers were still there, and I knew I would never escape. 10th story, The Cursed Graves of Hollow Willow. It was a chilly October night when I first set foot in Hollow Willow. The town was hidden deep within the woods of West Virginia, its existence barely marked on maps. Locals spoke of its ominous past in hushed tones. Strangers to stay away from the abandoned cemetery on the hill. I had come to document its legends, seeking a story that would set me apart as a journalist. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light barely illuminating the narrow path leading to the cemetery. As I approached, a chill ran down my spine, and an uneasy silence blanketed the air. The gate to the graveyard was rusted and covered in vine that creaking loudly as I pushed it open. Rows of crumbling headstones stretched before me, their inscriptions faded by time. At the center stood a massive oak tree, its gnarled branches casting twisted shadows across the ground. I set up my camera near a grave that seemed newer than the rest. Its marble surface was untouched by age, and the name etched on it sent through me. Abigarrick, 1902 to 1920. According to local lore, Abigail was a young girl accused of witchcraft and hanged by the town elders. Her spirit, they said, still wandered graveyard, seeking revenge. Suddenly, a low whisper carried through the air. leave this place." The words were barely audible, but clear enough to freeze me in place. I spun around with my flashlight, but there was nothing there. The wind picked up, howling through trees and sending dead leaves skittering across the ground. Determined to stay, I ignored the warning and continued to explore. As I walked, my foot caught on something and I fell hard to the ground. When I looked back, saw a skeletal hand protruding from the earth. My heart raced as I scrambled to my feet. Suddenly, the ground beneath me began to tremble. The oak tree at the center of the cemetery seemed to come alive. Its branches stretched out like clawed hands, and a deep groan echoed through graveyard. High-pitched and maniacal, coming from all around me, to run, but that the gate had disappeared. Instead, a thick fog enveloped the cemetery, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The laughter grew louder, joined by muffled cries and the sound of chains dragging across stone. Out of the fog emerged a figure. It was a young woman in a tattered white dress, her eyes hollow and glowing with an unearthly light. You should have listened. Her voice was a blend of sorrow and rage. Before I could react, she lunged at me, her icy hands closing around my throat. I woke up to the sound of my own screams echoing through the graveyard. My camera was gone. The grave marked Abigail Merrick was now empty. The sun was rising, but its warmth did little to ease the cold that had settled in my bones. I stumbled out of the cemetery, my mind racing with what I had just experienced. Weeks later, when I developed film from my camera that I found back in my car, there was only one photo on the roll. It was a picture of me in the graveyard, but behind me stood Abigail and countless other shadowy figures. I never returned to Hollow Willow. But even now, I sometimes hear her in my dreams. You should have listened.